I think the lack of a Democratic primary actually is in some weird way hurting Biden in that if he
Mm.
were having to distinguish himself from other contenders and make the case for what he's going to do in the next term, that would be out there. We'd be seeing that play out at the debates. We know a lot of what Republicans plan to do because they just had these debates, and we know that Vivek Ramaswamy wants to raise the voting age, and we know that they all want to get rid of trans people for blah blah blah. We hear them make their case. So, Claudia, just to get this on the table a little bit, let's talk about the ways in which the economy is doing better in all fairness. So, Levitz opens his article with a little bit of a rundown. He says, the American economy is growing at a historically rapid clip. Unemployment is at near record lows, while job satisfaction is at an all-time high. Real wages have been rising for most of this year and are now higher than they were in 2019, when approval of the economy sat near a two-decade high. The percentage of prime age Americans in the labor force is higher than it's been since the 2008 financial crisis. And thanks to the abundance of employment opportunities, lower income workers have recovered roughly 25% of the increase in wage inequality that accrued between Ronald Reagan's election and Joe Biden. And then he says, and yet American voters have rarely given their economy lower marks. Claudia, are you of the belief that the gap there is largely driven by kind of internet vibes, hence the term vibe session?
At the core of it, I think COVID just broke people. I mean, when you ask people your livelihood, your job, you're going to the store shopping, it is so tied in with your life that how you're feeling in general about the world ends up showing up in how you feel about the economy. And especially, how do you feel going forward? We have had 2 years of my peers telling people recession is coming, recession is coming. I mean, this is not a warm, fuzzy thing to go to bed with. Like, maybe you do have more money in your bank account, but if it all falls apart, I mean, Americans know if you lose your paycheck, you're done. Right. And so for 2 years, we have subjected people to that. So, yeah, I mean, the vibes, but they're like tied to reality. And I just think COVID was very bad. Then the war in Ukraine came. Now we have a war in the Middle East. I mean, like, this is just a lot. And people are going to take that anger and they're going to point it at something. And the idea that it shows up in the economics, okay, but it can loop through, right? I mean, it is something people vote on. And if Biden doesn't win, we're going to be dealing with something very different than vibes in the economy. Like Trump would not be ushering in the ever better welfare state. So I think that's where it's a tricky, and I agree with Matt and you. I don't want to tell people how to feel. I don't want to say, hey, you're not living in the real world. I just want to understand what they're seeing, because I don't know, it's just hard, because all the things I would think about how are you doing financially? Like, if you go look at it, like that list you put out, they look good. And frankly, for the more progressive critique, I'm wearing my little full employment defenders t-shirt today. Today was jobs day. We had an excellent number for November. I mean, I could just unemployment moved down, payrolls continue to increase, the wage growth looks really good. And on the margins, this year we saw the highest level of Black male labor force participation. Women's prime age labor force employment rates hit an all-time high. Workers with disabilities are at the highest level of participation. So, I mean, we are talking about most Americans, most workers are doing better. And the ones who are really doing well, they have never done well. So it's kind of like, it gets hard for me to square it. I honestly don't care on some level who gets credit for it. I just want people to have these jobs. But something, I just can't wrap my head around it. And I do think it's not even just vibes. I think there is active disinformation. I mean, not from anyone here, but I think there's just a lot of negativity that's being fed. And it's like playing with fire. Like, you can channel anger and you can channel it for change, but you can also burn it all down.
I don't know. I'd spend a lot of time on I don't spend a lot of time on the voter polling and how to understand that kind of stuff. Personally, I have been kind of forced to think about it a little bit in this when it comes to this issue, and I feel like people really have their models for thinking about how people answer these questions are just really hard to get my head around, right? I mean, on the one hand, we know that a lot of it is just expressive, right? If you don't like the president, you say the economy is bad. If you like the president, you say it's good. So if Trump is elected the very next day, Republican support for the economy will go through the roof, even though obviously
Mhm.
nothing has changed. Um, and then when we start talking about, okay, let's put aside kind of these things that aren't just related to someone telling you about their personal situation. They're either reading stuff or they don't like the war, maybe. And so they also say they don't like the economy or whatever, right? If we get rid of that stuff, then we say, okay, what about their own personal situation? How is that driving them? If you actually look at individuals and follow them over time, their personal circumstances are up and down and up and down and up and down, right? So when you say, hey, like the median wage has gone up, okay, that's cool. Like, but the person who was earning the median wage last year is not the same person who's earning the median wage this year. People move up
Mm.
and down the distribution. So even in good years, you're going to see 40% plus of people, their incomes are going to go down because they moved around in the income distribution. So if you're actually thinking about individuals, it should be the case that even in like a great economy, a large minority of people are going to be having a bad time relative to the year before. They may have lost a job. They may have, their income may have gone down for any number of reasons. So I don't really know how to process that, right? Because in our data, we usually think about it cross sectionally. So we'll say something like low wage workers have seen the highest rise or whatever. But if you go and then look in the current population survey and you isolate the low wage workers from last year, and then you look at them this year, those are not the same people. Those people
Mm.
have gone up or they may have come out of the labor market. So what are we even talking about? Like if people were honestly just assessing their own personal situation, then it would always be that even in the greatest economy, due to income mobility alone, a lot of people are having a really bad
Yeah.
time.
Okay. So, but here's the thing. And having been someone who, well, I won't call rank on all the things with this, but this is always the case, right? You have this, you have cross section, you can look at panel data, you can have these direct survey measures, you can ask them about their income. I mean, like you name it, we've been doing this for a long time. And a lot of the official statistics are done really well. They're done in a very consistent way, even if it's not the same people, it's consistent. The thing that has come out with this discussion, it's about the disconnect. It's like you ask people and they say they're not doing well. I would expect it to be more gloomy. Inflation's still too high and it's been high for, a year or two or a couple of years. But then normally you can take the things like, well, what's your income? What's the inflation? What's the unemployment rate? And you can like compare the two. And historically, they move together. I mean, to your point, there's churning. It's not like it's the exact same person that we're watching in the averages. But in general, they move together until COVID showed up. And then they broke apart. And that's the piece. Is this extra? Like, what is this extra
Right.
anger? Is it the normal stuff doesn't capture it, like something has changed? But I don't see where like the insecurity. I mean, we have more people working, we have more full-time, not part. So all that story of like what would be making it churn more so that we're missing it.
So that's where I think, if, and again, we can, if we're, if we just want to, it's not totally trolly. And I'm not the only one who said this. I saw Gabriel Zuckman had a tweet on it yesterday. It's not totally trolly to say something weird's happening, something unique is happening. And you say, okay, what is kind of unique? And what was unique was we had a pretty cool welfare state for
Yes.
18 months. And then it just, boom, just gone. Like those
Yes.
cuts, if you just analyze those cuts alone, and let's pretend Trump is doing them. Dude, I mean, it's savage. I read a story the other day. This guy was dying of pneumonia, and his parents were calling the Medicaid office. He'd been on Medicaid for 30 years because he's disabled, but he had got knocked off because, they're undoing the COVID Medicaid stuff, and they don't actually know who is eligible or not. And they're on the phone. This man's dying. And, obviously that's an extreme case, but there's 11
Mm-hmm.
million of those people. That's pretty
Yeah.
bad.
Well, but after the Great Recession, he'd already be dead, or his equivalent. Like the American Rescue Plan did not happen.
Well,
The
he
enhancements of the
in his weird case, no, because he had been on Medicaid for 30 years because he was disabled. The reason they kicked him off is because they're kicking people off of COVID Medicaid, and they actually don't know who is on COVID Medicaid and who isn't.
No, at Bloomberg Opinion, I write pretty often about inequality and the Medicaid issue. Like, yeah, no, it's been it's like going through all the pieces of like the rescue plan. For someone like me, you would have known all of these. It's like, oh wow, that was in the rescue plan too. Oh wow, and you're learning about it as it's expiring. Right now, these programs,
Yeah.
they're touching like a sliver of the population, and most Americans really don't care about poor people. I mean, they should, but right. I mean, you have this thing going on, but it's kind of like we fought really hard. I think everyone here involved to make sure that what was after the Great Recession didn't happen again. Like the rescue plan was what was missing. And we did it this time, and it was all temporary because it was designed to fight a recession. There were some things that were absolutely intended to get extended that didn't. They couldn't get through Congress. So would it have been better just not to have had the rescue plan? I mean, to me, that's kind of what this discourse feels like. Instead of saying,
I mean,
hey,
I think the argument is to push for more and to question why it was that there didn't seem to be a more vociferous fight, frankly, to maintain what ultimately were popular programs that didn't just go to the poor, that for once were not just exclusively these means-tested programs, but programs that had a much wider breadth. So there were people who fully expected there to be some kind of student cancellation that was meaningful. There were people who expected, who never even dreamed of something like a child tax credit and then saw it ripped away from them. And Eric Levitz deals with this argument in his piece. And he says specifically about the child tax credit issue that he says leftists might wish for politicians to interpret the contemporary economy popularity as an indictment of welfare state retrenchment. During the pandemic, the government established new social welfare programs. They expired. So from one angle, it might look like the real political lesson here is that American public demands a larger welfare state. This is what politically leftists would like to be arguing, and why I think that focusing on this and focusing on pushing Biden to do better is a good idea. Eric argues, though, that this is not the message that Washington is hearing, not least because it is not the one that voters have been conveying. In polling, he says, a majority of Americans opposed making Biden's child allowance permanent. There was a link. I clicked on the link. In the poll that he's citing, a majority of Democrats, 55%, still wanted the child tax credit to continue. And I would argue that's the demographic group that Biden needs to be most concerned of. But moreover, that same article that he linked to included another poll in which 56% of people overall, not just Democrats, supported continuing the child tax credit. I didn't appreciate the kind of sophistry built into his article, but I want to give you a chance to respond, generally speaking.
And I that paragraph really bothered me. And I think it's very funny because the child tax credit stuff, they use the polling on that and they say, it wasn't as popular as you might think. And then, but the counter argument there is to say, maybe don't believe that poll. Like maybe when you ask someone, do you think this temporary program, which is how it was pitched to the public, though in policy circles, everyone understood that they were going to try to make it public. Do you think this temporary program should be forever? Maybe in polls, they do have a kind of, desirability bias around not wanting to say they support the welfare state or whatever. But then it actually turns out when you take $1,000 from them per kid, while you're also, by the way, eliminating the free school meals that their kids got to eat, which is worth another about $1,000 a year, that actually they don't like that. And that would have been the conventional wisdom. Like, I think it's so funny that prior to the expiration of CTC, everyone thought the reason CTC was that temporary expansion was going to be permanent is because no way you can cut this back. People are not going to stand for it. And then there was some polling where it looked like slim minorities or slim majorities will stand for it. It did expire, and then you get this backlash, and instead of saying, I don't know, maybe we were wrong about trusting them, maybe we were right all along, and that when that actually hit the pocketbook, they weren't very happy about that, even if they may not be able to express it, even if right now they go, it's not that I lost the CTC, it's the inflation, because if the inflation didn't go up, I would be fine if I didn't lose the CTC. I'm not sure people can identify which of the variables are the ones that are upsetting them, you know?
And at the end of the day, this is not on people. Right, like that, the child tax credit should have been renewed. That was great policy. Finally, we addressed deep poverty in the United States for children. I mean, it's just, but what happened? And inflation happened, right? Inflation came after the rescue plan, 2021, 2022. I was on and still on team transitory, right? Like what was pushing it up? There was COVID. It was things from Ukraine. It was going to go up and it was going to come down. It took a year longer than we thought, but everybody on the left walked away. Not everybody, but I mean, I was at private meeting last year and had one of our progressive peers screaming in my face about being team transitory and how much harm that had done to Biden. And it's like, well,
what do
where
you mean by that?
That
Just to clarify,
Biden saying it was going to come down. Like if he had stuck to his guns and said the reason inflation went up was because of COVID and the reason it went up was because of Ukraine, he could have been doing a freaking victory dance this entire year because it's clear it was. Right. And instead, they sent people very established. As soon as inflation took off, the White House reverted to a very establishment Dem position. I mean, the individuals that they were sending to go work with Joe Manchin on the Inflation Reduction Act, which could have included, or with what could have been extensions of the child tax credit, were very like Clinton Dem people who don't believe in not having a work requirement, and we're just furious about inflation. So it's like we needed to go to bat for these programs. The Biden White House, they got progressive programs in place, and then they hung them out to dry when the going got tough. And I think that's part of the anger. Like I'm angry too, but it's like in weird different directions because it could have happened. We could have gotten that child tax credit.
And if you were worried, specifically about the inflationary aspect of it, because you're like, we're just dumping too much money, that's a different thing from including the poor. You could have gone back to the $2,000 credit and just said, but we're going to include the poor. That would not have put hardly any money into the thing, but it would have had a huge impact to just stop cutting them out the way we do. So,
but go find the establishment Dem economist that's going to back that up.
Well, wait a minute, Matt. Help me understand. I'm sorry. You're saying that if you go back to the 2000 checks, what do you mean?
So
that's
the CTC. So the 1 year CTC that cut child poverty in half or whatever. It wasn't just that; it was other things as well. But we'll put that aside. The 1 year CTC it did two things. It increased the benefit from $2,000 to $3,000 per kid. And it made it so that poor people could get it. So this is weird, but poor people don't actually get the child tax credit. The very poor don't get any. The sort of poor get a little bit because it's phased in.
They don't pay enough taxes?
Oh. Yeah. Well, it's based on your labor earnings. So you basically get 15 cents on the dollar for every dollar you earn until you get to a certain point. So if you make very little, you don't get any money for the CTC. And they just got rid of that. And they said, we're going to start the full benefit at $0 of earnings. So there were two changes: increase it by 1,000, and then make sure the poor get the full benefit. And if you were worried specifically about saying, look, we can't afford this, we're dumping too much money in, it's going to cause inflation, all you had to do was say, okay, when we went from 2,000 to 3,000, we'll just go back to 2,000. We'll cut that down back to 2,000, but we're not going to get rid of that part where we included the poor. So the poor are still going to get the 2,000.
Right.
And that would not have cost very much money at all.
But that would have been the big ideological shift. I mean, that's my thing about the establishment Dems. That piece at the bottom, the work requirements, I mean, that's what they put in with welfare reform under Clinton. That's the whole, like, we want to incentivize work. That was the piece that was really like, Manchin, there's no way I'm going to extend it unless the work requirements
he
come
just
back.
Actively thought the poor shouldn't get it because they're going to, there was a story where he's like, they're using on drugs and whatever. So that's where we are.
Protected it from everyone. Like there is research on similar kinds of income transfers that come out in bits and pieces. That the child tax credit was not inflationary. Like it's structured in a way, it comes out monthly. It's a relatively small benefit. It's not like it's going to put all of a sudden a bunch of pressure on supply, but that like the White House didn't make that case, right? Like it's really straightforward. And if you could have kept at least a portion of the bump up for everybody, you could have potentially gotten it through for the bottom, right? Like a lot of times it's kind of the adding on. Like if everybody gets a benefit, then you can help the bottom. But if you're just helping the bottom, then it turns into a big...
Well, it was funny because, not to go back to the polling, which I've said you should ignore, if you asked the specific question of do you want to include the poor, because you could break up the different pieces of it, that one polled positively.
Really?
Good.
Yeah.
Well, Claudia, let me ask you this, because what you just finished saying sounds to me like the kind of critique of the Biden economy and the Biden economic policy choices that the left has been making. But it feels sometimes like when the left makes that critique out loud, During an election season, we get, oh my God, you just want Donald Trump to win. What's the point of bringing it up? You're going to disincentivize Biden or Democrats from wanting to use a more progressive approach to recessions going forward. You got to just keep quiet. So, what is the disagreement here? Is this fundamentally just purely a political disagreement between a faction? And this really comes out in Eric Levitz's article, between a faction that seems rightly or wrongly, primarily concerned with insulating Biden against legitimate critique because of a fear of what it means to have a Trump presidency, and a different part of the left, which says it is Biden and the Democrats' obligation to earn votes. If we don't pressure them to be the best, most populist and popular candidate they can be, that in fact is going to make them more vulnerable to Trump, and of course, going to keep us ratcheting to the right policy-wise, and so we have a more and more conservative country. And that it is our obligation, in fact, as the left, as leftists, and not just this amorphous left that gets bandied around in this article, to keep applying that pressure.
I don't know the answer. I think this is where it gets wrapped up, and particularly as someone, and Matt fits and you in this category, trying to look at the conditions, the programs, like what was in place, what went away, what could be possible, what do we absolutely want to avoid ever have happening again, right? And so there's this in the policy debate, which I'm all about getting the best absolute policy advice I can get. What should be the programs? And I think actually we probably agree on a lot of those things. And then there's this, we're in an election year. We've had this absolutely wild ride. I'm angry. We're maybe angry about different things, but I mean, there's just a lot. And I actually don't know how to be constructive. I mean, I'm at a point where I'm just like, maybe I should go do my work on the Fed and just walk away. I'm not even sure I'm helping, but I'm scared.
Yeah, it's a funny debate because it's, basically what you're saying is the Levitz argument basically amounts to, hey, when you guys, it's assuming you think I'm operating in good faith and I'm not just trying to tank Biden because I'm just like a chaos agent or whatever, and you think that, this thing he's been writing about since 2011, like he's serious about it. Basically, the idea is if I just continue to talk about the issues that I am interested in and care about, the welfare state and unions and whatever, and I assess it and I inform people, people like to read my stuff, and I say, hey, we're just having a policy discussion here, we didn't get the PRO Act passed, so we're going to still need to do the union reform. Build Back Better didn't get passed, so we didn't really get a whole lot of welfare changes, like a little bit of prescription drug stuff, but that in having that discussion, unfortunately, that also bleeds over into people's electoral behavior. And so now I'm not supposed to have the discussion. I wish should I just put a disclaimer?
I'm sorry that telling the truth hurts Biden.
Think of this as an abstract policy debate. Don't apply it to any electoral questions. Or can we have this debate in private where only people who are resilient enough mentally to just absorb the policy critique without getting so soured on it that they go vote for Trump for some weird reason? I would do that, but that's not on offer. So to me, I can't imagine that the upshot is supposed to be, don't continue your policy advocacy just, in the way that you've been doing it for this long. Now, I could see if you want to say, don't just take wild ass shots at Biden for no reason, but I don't think I've done that. I don't think anyone's accused me of that even. So,
well, and I think, and I haven't accused you that, I don't think that the Dems have done a good job, particularly the White House, and also Congress to some extent, of help. They just created a vacuum. How should we think about the last years of the policy and what's happened in the economy? They just don't have a clean message. And I think that shows a lot of the tension within, say, the White House and the different parts of the left. And one good example is the messaging, or the way they want us to think about inflation. This is a greedflation, which oh my gosh, people are going to want to blame something. They're going to blame the White House, or they're going to blame companies. Why are we not totally leaning into greedflation? Or do we do this fuzzy, the market and blah, blah, blah? And you've seen Biden step into it and step out and step into it and step out. And it's just could you just make an argument? I mean, I have policymakers, not at the White House, call me up and be like, okay, how do we message this? And I'm like, I don't know. It's you shouldn't have to ask me. By this point, you all should know how to message inflation.
In 2 years that we've had the lowest inflation of any major country in the world. Let me be clear. Any corporation that's not passing these savings on to the consumers needs to stop the price gouging. And as my friend Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania calls it, greedflation. American people are tired of being played for suckers. Look at all the hidden fees you have. You find out, you call up your bank and you want to find out what the balance in your account is. They charge you $20. I can go on and on and on. It's wrong. One thing I said after we passed all these major pieces of legislation, it's the next big battle is going to be whether the very wealthiest among us and the biggest corporations begin to start paying their fair share. I'm not talking about 80%, 70%, 90%. I'm talking about the highest tax rate in America is 38%, 36%. Let me be clear. The Speaker, Donald Trump, and the MAGA Republicans here in Congress are committed to protecting their outrageous tax cuts for those at the very top. And they're going to continue to oppose investing in all those programs that help people, whether it's in education, healthcare, whatever.
So that's, I think, one of my frustrations is like, I don't know. This is bad.
Well, there was reporting about this at the end of last month, right? There's this article from The Hill. Democrats urge Biden to revamp campaign's economic message. I mean, there's obviously a camp internally that's saying, look, I know you tried to make fetch happen with Bidenomics, but it obviously isn't working. We're down to the wire. We got to switch it up. And you have a bunch of Democratic insiders willing to go on the record saying you got to try something else. Now, the greedflation thing is an interesting question because I did see the stories that came out about, what was it, the egg industry that was just recently had to pay a fine over price fixing. I think there were a couple of other industries as well recently that have been in focus, really validating a message that the left has been carrying out through this inflation conversation over the last 2 years or so. But it does feel to me, as someone on the left who's been making the leftist greedflation argument, I remember I have felt some pushback from a kind of centrist liberal economics perspective that doesn't really want to lean into the idea of, well, if it's greedflation, then what do you do about it? Suddenly, do we have to care more about antitrust? Do we have to be more progressive in terms of taxing wealthy corporations or business owners? Do we have to open up this whole other realm of progressive policymaking that Biden has been very clear that he and his donors don't want to go down that road? And it feels like the reason that they haven't leaned into that greedflation argument, perhaps this is my own cynical projection, is because that's too, FDR, we're going to set price caps, we're going to get the government really involved in the markets. And that's just a little too socialism-y for what Biden is up for and for what the Democrats are up to right now. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.